hello again. So I've got a rocket ready to go on the pad, but before I jump to that, I'm going to create my first Mercury, or rather, sorry, Atlas sounding rocket. So we're roughly late 58, early 59, something like that. So around that time, they started making use. So look how much cash we have from those previous contracts. They started hiring human astronauts, which is nice. So I'll be looking into that pretty shortly. And the craft that would eventually put people into orbit is related to the one we're building here. And so we will, which version of it should I use? Let's remove that for now. Does it need it? It does need it. Okay, well, I'll use that. So in the Atlas rocket here is a pretty interesting rocket. So it has a very light and unusually light construction. It's called like a balloon tank or a balloon stage, which is in part why during this kind of its designed life of this style, I don't believe they had any solid rockets ever strapped to it to strengthen it, or to get more thrust at takeoff, the way that you would see with the Thor stage as it progresses to being the Delta rocket. So there was a number of generations, because it was such a big change of design. Let's see. Sewer served as the booster for the Atlas. Check. And so those are new engines for me, but they were a bit cheaper to unlock because I've already paid to unlock a number of other engines like this one and its relative that I was using on the Thor. We're getting a bit distracted. So the version of the Atlas that was actually made use of for the Mercury program was the Atlas D, I believe. And so what we're building will be more like the Atlas A or Atlas B. So just because of the way this is constructed, I do need to have this core engine on. But in practice, I'm not going to use it, which is kind of a shame. I wish I didn't have to pay for it, but I do appear to have it on there to attach this structure. So fair enough, I'm willing to pay that difference. And we're going to start. I'm kind of paying attention to how tech transfers through these, and so I'm going to use, even though I can purchase a better version of this engine, if you want to take a moment to look at the values. This is a slightly better version, so let's see, what is the burn time we can get here? Because in the first few flights of this craft in reality, of the Atlas A and the Atlas B, they're just kind of generally trying to test the concept and the structure, and they had a lot of trouble with it. It would kind of collapse because it's a lightly constructed tank, and this is the most engines you'd really ever put on anything. I think I've never built so far that I can recollect a first stage with more than one engine, and here we're throwing 3 on. And they have a pretty substantial thrust. It's a very big, very powerful rocket, which in part explains why you see its use much later on still. So this very first engine, so kind of the big difference between the NA3 and the NA5 is the burn time is a bit better, and it probably has a better starting reliability, but I'll look into that. So right now I'll just start with the NA3 and do a flight of that. And so I can't burn these booster engines for more than 2 minutes and 15 seconds, it looks like. So let's just drain this tank and fill it up. Okay, let me remove these so I can see what the right fill rate is. Oh, I see. It's showing me a I need to remove these to get the right fill rate, because this is the first thing I have where it's burning multiple engines together that use the same fuel. It gives me multiple filling options. So there we go. So I filled it up with the fuel mixing ratio for those, and I'm not going to run the sustainer stage, the center, and I'll kind of discuss more of how it functions and such later on. But right now, we're going to use it just as a just a sounding rocket stage, really. Okay, so let's just throw a basic guidance core on it, because that's required to pull up MechJeb, and it didn't cost me very much, so fair enough. And so even with not using the core engine, just these 2 booster engines, we're going to have a high enough thrust to get off the ground, 1.2 sea level thrust. And if we did have the core in, that would be increased. Not a ton, but you'll see in a later Atlas test, you'll see why it has so much less thrust than the others. And let's see, if we run it full, we're going to get we're going to go well beyond the burn time, the rated burn time. But in this case, I'm okay with that because really I'm just using this as a basic sounding rocket. I'll probably get a little bit of science out of it, but really it's just about getting a bit of experience with these engines so that they're more reliable in the future. Let me flip those around. I'll put that inside my covering here. And there were a lot of tests done with this rocket stage, like I said, the Atlas-A and the Atlas-B and the Atlas-C. There was a lot of testing and modification and refinement. But it was America's like first and biggest and greatest attempt at an intercontinental ballistic missile. And it's kind of a radical design. The Soviets didn't pursue anything similar to it, this balloon tank structure. And so by balloon tank, I mean, the tanking structure here is very light. And in fact, if it's not pressurized, like when it's ready to go on the launch pad, it's full of fuel. And if it's not pressurized, it actually really can't support its own weight. The tankage is actually that light. And that's because one of the most important factors in determining how a rocket stage will perform is how much it weighs when it's empty, when it's burned out. And the lighter, the better. And so that means if you can get away with making your tanks like literally very extremely thin, so thin they can't support themselves against the air when the tank is empty, if that'll work for you, that'll work for you. So let's call it the Atlas-A sounding rocket. So this is going to kind of represent some of the first couple of tests. We won't be flying this today, but I will record the flight of this because it's pretty likely to fail. If I check test flight on this engine, it starts with a 22-minute mean time between failure, and you can, with this specific config, you can triple that. Actually, I'm kind of willing to pay for the next config up just to compare those numbers directly, because as far as I'm aware, there's no other in-game interface I could use to do that comparison. So now I've switched it to the 5. Actually, that might be reporting incorrectly, actually. Because it says 22 minutes. It's still the same numbers, really, whereas I think they should be different. I'll check with Agathorn, who sets these up. And what about the core engine? Yeah, it's pretty reliable as well to start with. So I'll check his numbers. But I just expected, because I switched configs, that the two different configs would have different starting reliabilities. But we still have plenty of fine-tuning to do with things like that. And in part, that's why I'm doing this America playthrough, because I know a lot of the parts are well configured, the engines and everything. It's not like when I'm in my Russian playthrough, where I would run into something that just wasn't configured or is poorly configured or something, and then have to configure it myself. Like this FASA stuff is very honed. All the masses are well known, thrusts and everything. They've been well paid attention to, because people have been configuring them for realism overhaul for a long time. And there we go. So I think we've got her constructed. So we're going to save it. It's not going to run for very long. So in this design, we'll be exceeding the rated burn time of the booster engines. And so we're guaranteed. Actually, it's going to be funny because there's two engines, so we're guaranteed that one of them is going to fail, and that will be interesting. Oh darn! I shouldn't have built it. It has the avionics unit, which technically will give me, I think that counts as science. I'm going to cancel that build though, and because I'm going to throw an antenna onto it, just one antenna, and let's say a thermometer, just some basic science, so I can complete, I can do, get some sounding rockets money out of this, because it's a pretty expensive rocket. If you look there, it's almost 3,000, I guess, units, dollars, however, whatever we want to call them right now. I'll probably be popping some of that stuff off in the end. But yeah, so we've got this constructed. Let's save, launch, build, and so I'll cancel that first one because it didn't have those. So this will mean I can earn a bit of that cash back, possibly the cost of the flight, if and only if it's successful enough to complete some of those contracts. Because a lot of these rockets, as they were developed, were used as sounding rockets like this, where they'd be used, you'd have some science attached to them, and if they complete, that's great. You gain some new knowledge as well as new knowledge about the stage. All right, so estimated. So that's the first one I set to construct. So let's tell it to scrap. Yep, and we've got this one ready to launch. So let's launch it. So I I believe I've shown a picture or my construction of this. I may be recalling incorrectly. But this is the next generation of upper stage, so the Agena-A. And in this, you'll see, like, it was, at this point in history, and as well as in my game, because that's how I'm trying to plan it, I'm launching it on my nice, reliable Thor first stage. So we have a lot of experience under our belt. The Thor first stage is nice and reliable. We know we have high confidence in its ability to succeed, and we're throwing this brand new first stage on it, never flown, no data units. It shouldn't have any increase through usage yet, as far as I'm aware. Yeah, it's just a completely fresh engine, whereas this one is halfway to being at max data. And so there you can see one of the tanks of the upper stage, the pattern there. I made a custom pattern for just a real hack job because I wanted it to look a bit more like the actual Atlas A. So you can, if you compare our previous upper stage, the Able, to this is a lot wider of an upper stage. And so that means we're putting more weight, not a ton more weight, or we're not, sorry. Now, when this is literally in tons, that might be a bad word, incorrect word to use. Not a huge amount more mass. Let's see. So on my little notes here, the Able stage was about 2 tons, and this Agena-A is twice that mass. So it is certainly an increase in mass. And the big difference, so one thing is that this Agena-A upper stage is twice the mass of the previous stage we were using, and on top of that, it has an engine with twice the thrust. So it's quite the advance, and that's why it's the Agena-A, much like the Atlas A. It's the first version in a development program to make a more mature rocket. So in the case of the Atlas, they're working towards the Atlas D when they have improved its reliability through kind of refinement and testing to the point where they feel confident enough. That's not where I want to go. Heading 0, or actually heading 180. Sorry, I have to do some quick corrections of this. See, I record these live because I'm not an editor and I don't want to edit videos, so I kind of think and speak and fly at the same time. So I'm going to kind of try to put this into an. It doesn't really have the most important payload. It's sort of a sounding rocket because that second stage is brand new. There we go. So we're kind of heading south now. All right. Yeah. It's a much heavier upper stage. It's not very mature. The engine has twice the thrust of the Able engine, which means it's a heavier engine. And you can see it's only rated to burn for 2 minutes, and at that point, it's going to even start with a very high thrust-to-weight ratio. So it's an ambitious project. And later versions of the Agena will be a much larger tank, because on an upper stage there's no good obvious reason to me to have that high of a thrust-to-weight ratio. Or so you can have a larger. That means either you should have a smaller engine. You're doing something inappropriate because either you should have a smaller engine, or alternatively you should have a bigger fuel tank. So the Agena-A is 4 tons, whereas the later Agena-B or D models, once they standardize and increase their size, is almost 8 tons, which is pretty big considering the first stage of this is just 50 tons. And so that the Agena stage will evolve later on to be used on the Atlas, to be used in a number of things, including the first spy satellites. The Keyhole project, or the Keyhole hardware as part of Project Corona. Okay, so let's arc down now. So by having a heavier upper stage, and I'm going to go back and look at some of the numbers from my previous videos, because honestly that's part of why I record these videos. When this first stage burns out, you'll notice that we'll probably, if I had had a better trajectory, but we're definitely going to have a lower velocity than we did in a previous with an Thor Able stage. We'll be moving slower because we've pushed a much heavier upper stage to this point. And I was going to say we should also have a lower altitude, but of course my ascent was not very good at all. So we're moving to an important period here where this it's going to burn out. And because it's a heavier upper stage, part of the consequence of that is this will be, it's not a low acceleration by any stretch of the imagination at stage burnout, but it is lower than with the previous stage. So I want some of that data. I don't want to, okay, there we go. So you notice we didn't hot stage it. So there we go. So we're separating it away. That's because, so we'll keep an eye on this engine. It's currently very stable. I kind of wish ullage settled away a little faster, but there we go. You see that? So we've got nitrogen thrusters on this. It's a very capable, very advanced upper stage compared to anything we've done before. So let's imagine when we staged there, we aren't certain that this fuel is going to be stable. And so what we do is we ullage forward. In this case, I just turn on RCS because I set up those 4 ports down there, and then tick, I stage, and the engine happened to work. Well, that's nice. And unfortunately, the effect is a little high. I'll have to check. I've been noticing that a bit with the most recent real plume. And we're starting to gain data. This was probably a very low number during that initial startup, but it was we're off to the races. And it's a very powerful upper stage, as I said before. So it already has a really high thrust to weight ratio. I find the effect is a bit higher than it should be. Wonder if maybe it's not getting shifted, or it's getting shifted inverse to how it was before. But I'll have to bring that up to Felger. And anyway, let me pop off these covers. Hopefully they don't break anything. No, because we're under such a high thrust weight ratio. So it's a much more capable upper stage, but it's really just a test bed for these technologies. They didn't really use the Agena-A for very much, for very long. So it can place a bit more payload into orbit than the Able could, but it can't do some of the things that the later Agena or other upper stages can do. Like it can't get into orbit really with a substantial amount of fuel left in itself, even if it didn't have an upper payload. Like you'll see in the Ranger program with the Agena, later Agena-D, when launched from an Atlas, the Agena stage has enough fuel left in it when it reaches orbit, and that engine will have the capability for a relight, which will be another fantastic technology to have. And so it can get into orbit, it can kind of park, get ready. So a parking orbit where it's kind of actually in Earth orbit, but waiting for kind of another trigger to to continue its real mission. And so it can park there and then send its payload and itself off to the moon. And so that requires not only a capable upper stage, but a light upper stage. So this upper stage is fairly heavy when it's empty. I think that's most of what I want to cover, but I really wanted to build this. There's no like prefab part. FASA has the Agena-D, but this is a really important step in history, building this Agena, the Agena-A. There we go, and we made it into orbit, plenty of delta V. So one of the things if you kind of poke the numbers, if you're like a real number hound, like I am sometimes, is that the amount of delta V we had when we launched you might not expect it to have got us into such a high orbit, but we did achieve a pretty high orbit, and part of that, there we go, you can see the first stage kind of arcing out, it looks like, and then it's going to crash down in the ocean south of Cuba there, which is why in reality they probably would have launched a mission like this from California, from Vandenberg, I think. I think that's in California. Could totally be wrong. But given that the Russians kind of controlled or had a very strong relationship with Cuba, at least, you wouldn't want them thinking you were sending a missile towards Cuba. And if something failed or you drop a stage, you don't want to drop your valuable technology where the Cubans can pick it up. Or even see your launches, really. So we've achieved orbit. We don't have any fuel left in the tanks here, but this is a really light, kind of just a basic payload, so I can complete some contracts, so I can get a little bit of cash back, just like I was describing with the Atlas, which I'll probably shoot straight up. I'm not going to try to get it into orbit because I won't be able to get it into orbit without using the center engine, which makes sense, of course, because in that case I am testing a first stage. But here, the test stage here was not the most capable. As we evolve things forward and we have these heavier and heavier upper stages, the Thor kind of stops being as relevant. It no longer is as powerful compared to some of the other technology we developed. But in this case, Thor is a perfect vehicle for testing out our Agena-A. And so it's achieved orbit here, and we were able to complete a number of lucrative contracts. So it was a very successful testing mission, which is a bit of a surprise. I kind of expect some of my first Agena test missions to fail, which is in part why I'm doing them without kind of an agenda, a major mission to complete with it. I think that's about all I wanted to cover with it. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy when it burns out. Like the weight of this is maybe 50 or 100 kilograms, if that. And so to send this to the moon, to shoot this by the moon, we would have to have the empty stage of the mass of this would also be heading towards the moon, right? And so we're just not quite capable there yet of the second stages of rockets like this being able to also, make a transfer to another, to the moon or to another planet. But it is able to place a fairly light payload into a polar orbit like this, which I believe was one of the few things it was actually used for, were kind of early tests of the launch and recovery hardware for early American spy satellites, which I find it to be a very interesting history. But yeah, I accomplished quite a bit in that video. It's a little longer than I usually aim for, but absolutely a success. So we've got the Agena here into orbit. We achieved some science from it, and we constructed that Atlas, like Atlas A or Atlas B, first stage as a sounding rocket to test it out. See, my preference would be for test flight to be balanced such that it makes some sense. Either you could just, once you've unlocked the technology, you do want to put a bit of money into the R&D of hardware, and of course that would require a bit of balancing of all around, but I'd like to have that choice where I can do missions like this, which I find enjoyable because of the risk. This, high risk, high reward. This mission could have entirely failed. I'd lose the entire build cost of that. So this window is where I would see an engine if I was developing it using kind of pay per day R&D. So I'd like to have both of those options valid in RP-0, but that would definitely take a lot of config work. But in the meantime, I'm fine kind of role-playing those simulation missions where I kind of there's a chance that Atlas Agena, or sorry, that Thor Agena mission could have failed, but it was actually successful. So next video we will definitely be flying this Atlas sounding rocket, and I'll have to look what other things we will be accomplishing soon. So that'll construct pretty quick because I've got this upgraded, my VAB upgraded fairly well. But it's still going to be a while till we unlock better hypergolics and we can do more capable lunar missions. And pretty much for the energy it takes to shoot something small towards the moon, you can also send something off towards a planet. So this will probably show some planetary timelines, and I'll explain those. I've explained them in some other videos, but not in this series. How and why I set those up, because they're extremely useful using Kerbal Alarm Clock to find, kind of identify planetary windows for you. So look forward to making that video in the future. Bye.